In late February of 2022, Putin shocked the world by invading its neighbor, Ukraine. We reflect on this conflict and examine it from a pastor's perspective. Welcome to the Unapologetic Show with Dr. Bobby Conway, the One Minute Apologist and co-host of the Pastor's Perspective Show on K-Wave. My name is Tim. I'm your host. Bobby, let's dive in. So, man, we are in the middle of kind of this giant conflict right now, and we really need some guidance. So hopefully we can give some guidance to the church and people that are just kind of wondering what's going on. What was something that surprised you about Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I think there are a number of things as I've reflected on this war that we're now watching over the last few weeks. One thing in particular is how, derailed the Ukrainians were in the fact that they weren't expecting this to happen, right? A lot of them weren't. They just thought, oh, this is Putin doing us threats. And then he comes in and he does it, and man, it's like, wow, it's game on. It was shocking because the last time I remember seeing images like this was, back when I was in high school in, 1990, 91, when you had the war with Saddam Hussein. Yeah. And it just brought back those memories. And it just blows me away to think that we're experiencing this and to see how close we are to being potentially in World War III. I don't think we're as far off from this as we could have realized. And, the other thing, too, is like I was saying to my wife maybe a few weeks before, just saying, man, our culture is really jacked up right now. I mean, things have changed, things have deteriorated. And then, let's throw a war in the middle of this now. I mean, it's just incredible when you think about what we've been through on our own landscape here in America. But I think the thing that's been really, impressive to watch is the Ukrainian spirit and to see how they've been able to show much more endurance. And that's been something that, nobody suspected either. Yeah. Boy, we thought this is going to be a short, quick war, and we've seen their resolve. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So one of the other questions that we have is there's definitely a battle of worldviews going on. So let's talk a little bit about what we can learn from the various different perspectives of these different worldviews that are happening in this conflict right now. What's your observations there? So for our listeners, this will be a little bit of moral philosophy. Yeah. But what happens is, like I once taught a course at the Bible College at Calvary Chapel in Murrieta called Jesus and the Moral Philosophers. And what I did with that is I looked at various moral philosophers throughout history. And my guiding question that I wanted them to consider is, what would the world look like if you were to take any one of these various moral philosophers, Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Augustine, any of them, right? Yeah. And overlay it on every human being on the planet? What kind of a world would we have? Yeah. And then it allowed me to provide a fruitful consideration of, well, what if we overlaid the Jesus ethic over all of humanity? How would our world be different? Well, when you are in moral philosophy courses and you're taking classes, morality is not just cut and dry. I mean, when it comes to things like morality, some would say morality is not objective. Others would say that it is. Some would say that there is no God that exists, therefore it is subjective. Some would say, well, God doesn't need to exist for morality to be objective. Then you can even come to different belief systems, right? You have Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. How do we account for morality? How do we account for the atrocities and the injustices that we see? How do we understand our viewpoint as it relates to war? Well, as I've been thinking about what we're seeing here, you have a little bit of this. Putin is kind of like your Machiavellian. Okay. And if anybody's ever read Machiavelli's The Prince, it's a short, riveting read. And basically, the advice of Machiavelli to the prince was might makes right. Use whatever means necessary to retain power. So a Machiavellian ethic if you're influenced by that, power is your ultimate. It's your summum bonum. It's the greatest good. And it doesn't mean you can't be a nice person, but it means that you can lie, you can cheat, you can do whatever you want. Yeah. So you see Putin operating like a Machiavellian. For example, agreeing to cease fire, and then we blow up,
a hospital with children in it.
Yeah, a maternity hospital. So you end up seeing these types of things. Well, why is it? Because you can say whatever you want, because your value is, I got to hold on to power and I got to keep people guessing. Yeah. And so a Machiavellian doesn't feel the need to play by the rules. And so trying to figure out Putin by a Western rule book isn't going to work. You have to get inside the mindset of what kind of thinking he has as it relates to retaining power. So what is Putin's vision? What does he ultimately hope to accomplish? And so when we start hearing talks on the news about, he's going to, agree to this or agree to that, we should hold that lightly. Yeah. Then you have over here, in America, you've got a lot of the world basically looking at, well, do we issue a no-fly zone? And people are like, well, that enters us into World War III. Yeah. And so there's a utilitarian ethic at play. And utilitarianism is like, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and they would talk about kind of like the maximum amount of benefits versus the least amount of consequences. Right. So what you see is a lot of weighing the consequences. And so there's a lot of utilitarian ethicists going on. Now, these people, they might not realize they're Machiavellian or utilitarian, but what I'm saying is this is why worldview matters. Yeah. And we need to understand. And so you can see some of this. Well, then you got the Ukrainians, and I think desperation can lead you, when you're on the side of having to defend, to being a deontologist. Yeah. And this is a Kantian-based ethic, which is a duty-based ethic. Yeah. And they're like, man, you have a duty, close up the skies. Yeah. There's this duty to help, and you can just see them pleading. So what you've got are these three conversations, right? You've got Machiavellians saying what they're going to do, and you've got utilitarians trying to talk to deontologists, and we're all speaking past each other. Right. And so I think we step back and we go, well, what do we do with that? Because it's kind of interesting. So that's been my observation a little bit as I've viewed this war of what we got going on. Now, a couple thoughts, because I would say, like, duty-based is, you have a right to do it. Like the danger of utilitarianism is you're always trying to do math, but that presumes we know the future. Yeah. That presumes we know exactly what Putin would do. So it's kind of like, to be crass, it's like it could feel like to the Ukrainians we're throwing condoms at the woman getting raped. Right. Yeah. Right. And it's like, man, we have a duty to like do something. Yeah. And so, what you have happening, like here in America in particular, and with NATO, you have people weighing out like, well, we just want to make sure. So then it provides questions is there any time to leverage some utilitarianism, even when we know we have a duty? So does the duty of deontology mean that we act immediately, or is there a reflective period to consider the consequences? And so this is where it can get kind of confusing too, because we might have a duty to act, but if you act so quickly, you could cause more problems. But if you don't act, you could cause more problems. Right. So this is where ethics gets really, really difficult. I think my big thought would just be, we have to hold with such a grain of sand what Putin says. My fear is, let's say we do follow a utilitarian ethic, right? We're going to do what's going to resolve what we think in the least amount of consequences. Well, what would that mean? Well, not closing up the airspace. Well, what if the Ukrainians are right? What if Putin's going to Poland next? Yeah. And what if he goes here? Well, then maybe we will see in history that, we should have intervened sooner because he was telling us what he wanted to do. The Ukrainians were telling us what's going to happen. People that were associates of Putin are saying this is what he's going to do. And so maybe we tried to just, do what we thought was best, but we ignored this Machiavellian worldview.
Yeah.
And as a result, we've been weakened because we waited so long. And as a result, more people have died.
Yeah.
So there's no guarantee that not closing up the airfield or whatever, if Putin continues on with what people are saying he's going to do,
right,
that this is going to turn out to be cheaper and less costly.
Yeah. Well, and especially when it comes to lives, I think another part of the worldview that accounts for some of this is Putin's view about Kiev and that's being kind of the center of the Rus people and how that goes back 1,000 years. And so he's kind of seeing this as somewhat of this, he doesn't really have a Christian worldview from what I understand. He's got kind of this mythological metaphysics. And so that plays into this Machiavellian worldview that you're talking about. And, he's saying, man, if we could just reunite this, if we could just get back to kind of the Soviet, Union, like the golden age or whatever Russia was, that's kind of part of his thinking in some sense. There was a recent poll that happened in Russia, and it was a significant amount of people, more than a majority, viewed Stalin favorably, and that was kind of like, whoa. And so that kind of plays into some of this, like how much pressure, because you're right, if he gets into Ukraine, is Poland next? How far does he push those boundaries? So that's really interesting. And that leads me to ask the question, how do you think that this plays into Russia being part of the end times and the book of Ezekiel 38 and 39? Do you think this invasion kind of points to that being something that's significant? Are we in the end times here?
Yeah, well, I mean, your point on the about him feeling like he owns this land. This is kind of the danger too, right? Yeah. With China, they're watching us. They have a desire to kind of take over Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine what the Ukrainians could feel like. Like, imagine if some leader emerged in England and felt as if America was his, because it was the Brits who came over to America, and they assumed it, and they should have never left. So now we're getting bombed because some person feels like this is his. Like, how would you feel, right? So you can imagine what they're experiencing a little bit. And by the way, the other thing, Tim, and I'm going to get to your question, but it's amazing how quick things get prioritized. We've had the luxury of sitting around talking about what's your preferred gender pronoun, but when things start blowing up, it's amazing how all of a sudden that's not the biggest topic on the menu, and that's not the most burning moral issue of our day, of whether you feel you identify as a he or a she or an it or a they or a them. Right now, just human lives are at stake. Right. So I would say that it's amazing how delusional people can get, and he's clearly delusional, and just power corrupts. I think as far as the end times and what does this mean for us in relationship to Ezekiel 38 and 39, there is one standpoint that does look at this, an eschatological standpoint that looks at Ezekiel 38 and 39, and we'll see that what you have is this battle of Gog, right, Magog, and you see like language of like Meshech, and some might say, oh, this is Moscow and Russia, and it talks about how there'll be armies from the farthest north that's going to come down and basically barrage Israel, and so there are certain end time theorists that will say this is lining up right now. Like Pat Robertson jumped on the air and said, okay, here it comes. We're in the end times. I think we always have to be cautious of stating that. Number one, it's not 100% certain that Ross refers to Russia. There's some that would make it sound that way, but that's not agreed upon in the scholarly world as it looks at the language there. So I would say we have to be open to the fact that, well, could that happen where, this is just the first attempt. Ukraine's going to be assumed, and then Poland and other places, and then eventually Israel. But I don't think we can know yet for certain. I think that there's some people, for example, that would say that was already fulfilled, that prophecy.
Yeah.
Others would say no, it's not yet. Others would say it's not required to be Russia that comes down from the north. While Russia's the furthest north, maybe the language that was being used was just kind of observatory language. It wasn't trying to be ultra literal. I mean, these are just some things that different people might throw out. For me, I think that if you saw, Russia continue to expand its empire, and then eventually they're coming into Israel, and you see these other forces, joining them in an alliance like Turkey, and Syria, and all this stuff coming together, it'd be something to, hey, maybe that is exactly right. But to go and say this is for sure when there's so much controversy around it, that's where we have to be cautious. But I can say, regardless of whether or not this is and that's how Ezekiel 38 and 39 are going to play out.
Right.
It does kind of have an end time feel right now. Like I can get a sense of like, wow, how people have felt at certain times in history past where they're wondering, boy, are we in the eschaton?
Yeah.
Well, we're more in eschaton today than we were yesterday, but it really does just feel like the world is completely falling apart in so many ways. But then again, it's like I could see, Tim, that what if you end up if here in America, for example, what if certain things get prioritized? Like, what if people all of a sudden are okay with the Second Amendment, that we're against, having a right to bear arms? Exactly. What if people who are against building up the military all of a sudden are like, it's important to have a military? So I could see some things, being put in check as a result of this as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. I do want to talk about and ask you specifically about some good that can come out of this. But before we get to that, I'd like to just remind our listeners that we are a listener and viewer supported ministry, and we would love for you to support this ministry. And one way you can do that is to jump on over to our YouTube channel on youtube.com/One Minute Apologist. Like this video, share it with your network, and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, this is available as an audio-only podcast, so you can check it out on all of your podcast players. And finally, one of the other ways that you can support this ministry is to join our financial support team, and you can do that by heading on over to oneminuteapologist.com and click on donate in the upper right hand corner. So we're going to get to do you see any good coming out of this conflict? What good can we draw from this, if any?
I mean, I think that there is some good that can come out of a time like this. And fortunately, I think that when we consider where we are, some of the good that can happen is we can really start to maybe appreciate the cost of those who shed their blood in the past for our own land. Like sometimes we minimize that. We lose sight of the great sacrifices. Like, here we are in America. There's been a lot of bloodshed in this land for freedoms that we experience that we forget about. And when we start sitting around and, again, having the luxury to just think our greatest priority of today's world is what is our preferred gender pronoun, as if every human being sitting around struggling with that, we're devolving as a country. And so, I mean, hopefully a value for human life, hopefully a value for our freedom and a greater appreciation, hopefully a greater value for how our hope doesn't need to be in this world. But, I think about, like, if I didn't have the Lord in my life, how insecure you could be in times like this. But as a Christian, we don't have to be falling apart emotionally. We can be steadfast and trusting. I think deepening our love just for one another, as for family, appreciating people. I think that the images that we see, as horrific as they are, it can make us more compassionate kind of people as we think about the pain that people are in. I think that good that can come out of it, it can help us to pray more, to get out of our own self. My son-in-law was being in the car with the tow truck driver. He had to drop his car off, and the tow truck driver was taking him on a drive back to our house to drop him off. And, the tow truck driver said, hey, at least I didn't wake up in Ukraine this morning.
Yeah.
And I think that it can put our pain in perspective to realize, wow, things are tough, but it can be tougher. I think that the good that can come out of this is kind of a return to realizing that there really is such a thing as good and evil.
Yeah.
You see the evil that has come out of a man like Putin.
Yeah.
And I think that just calling evil, we have been blurring the lines. We call evil good, good evil.
Yeah.
But I think another thing is the need for our heart's cry for justice. I think we can see this, like where people can just sit around and not really recognize, like how could God, for example, punish the Canaanites.
Right.
Well, just picture a bunch of Putins, stomping on people. You see in moments like this where you want justice. The culture that doesn't understand justice doesn't understand evil and doesn't understand pain. But when you end up observing it like this, all of a sudden you realize that we're built to understand justice because we're created in God's image, and God is a just God.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, going right along with that, I would say, we're seeing Putin's true colors, the true evilness of that. What's something that specifically the church can learn from the bravery that you mentioned earlier of the Ukrainians?
Well, I think it's just that, Tim. It's the bravery. Like, for example, we're being inspired by a leader with spine and conviction.
Yeah.
And man, like it is attractive. Like I hate the thought of us just looking weak as a church.
Yeah.
And I think that in a lot of ways, there's something about when your life is on the line and your land is on the line that it brings out a boldness in us. And Zelensky has modeled this boldness. And I think, man, if Zelensky could be this bold for his land, and if Zelensky could be this bold for the lives of his people, how much more should we be bold for the church of Jesus Christ, where Christ laid down his life? How much more should we be bold to share the gospel for non-believers to come to know Jesus so that they can be spared a life, an eternity of separation from God? So I think that what we are recognizing is a world that's being inspired by courage, a world that's being inspired by boldness, where he's getting standing ovations from Congress and from NATO.
Yeah.
And I think that's what won the applause of the early church, is they were being persecuted. They were being spiritually bombed, spiritually nuked, and they were dying for their faith, and people were staying strong in the midst of it. And that's where apologetics, ultimately let your life be an apologia, an apologetic. When people see how we suffer well, when we persecuted, but we still stay courageous. And I think that's where we look so weak as a church. We look the opposite of courageous, Tim. We look weak because we're so worried about offending. And I think if there's anything that the church can receive right now is, man, if these people can be so bold for their nation, how much more should we be willing to be bold for the Great Commission?
And so let's end with this question. What would you say to those who want to help, but they feel just so hopeless right now?
I mean, I can feel that. You sit there and you look at this world and you feel overwhelmed. And I would say, I really do think we can't underestimate the power of prayer. We might not be able to measure our prayers being answered, but prayer makes us a certain kind of person. Even if we're praying and we go, man, it doesn't seem, and I'm praying that this won't happen. I'm praying Kiev won't get, more bombarded, and it does. And I'm praying that Odessa won't be taken over, and say it does. Like, these are all the things where we can keep praying, because prayer makes us a compassionate kind of person. And I think that whether our prayers are answered or not, I want to stand before the Lord to know that I had enough compassion to ask the God who could do something about it to do something about it. I want to be able to know that when I'm limited, that I'm praying about it. So I think we can pray. I think we can stay informed. I think that there's opportunities for those who have resources that they can give to it.
Yeah.
I think that we need to become wiser citizens in our own country and realize, what are we fighting for? Like what are our priorities going to be when we go to the voting booths?
Yeah.
Like what kind of values are we meant to stand for? I think these are important things for us to consider.
Yeah. Lots of great things to reflect. I mean, one thing that I would add is, stay in the Word, right?
Yeah.
Continue to keep our eyes focused on Jesus, and that's where our hope should truly lie when all of this chaos is going on around us, when this evil is so prevalent, when it's so real, and when we're seeing it, to keep our eyes on Jesus. Any final thoughts or closing words?
Nope. I'm just thankful that we got a chance to address this. This is a scary time for our world, but it's also an opportune time for the church to really rise up and be the hope to the nations, and in particular to Ukraine. I think this is a great opportunity for the church.
Amen. Well, thank you for checking out this episode of the Unapologetic Show, where we defend truth without compromise. We'll see you next time.